Good afternoon. I'm very happy to welcome Professor Miguel, a professor of Environmental and Resource Economics at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Miguel is also the director of the Center for Effective Global Action at the same university. Thank you, Ted, for participating in this 41st edition of the Barcelona Graduate School Lecture Series. I would also like to welcome Gianmarco León and all of you students and members of the Academia in Barcelona, ladies and gentlemen, to this event here at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra. In a moment, I will hand you over to Gianmarco, who will highlight Dr. Miguel's influential approach to economic analysis. But before this, let me say a few words about the importance of the right design of economic policies. I will introduce a couple of examples that may not appear to have many things in common, but that show this critical need to measure the effectiveness of policies and the importance of a well-thought-out design and deployment of programs. Take, for instance, policies of low interest rates and unorthodox monetary policy measures. These policies certainly served to reduce risk aversion in moments of acute market uncertainty and macroeconomic stress, and may have had some bearing on economic activity and prices. But at the same time, they entailed huge costs in terms of financial stability, which we are beginning to witness clearly. The collateral effects of unorthodox monetary policy constitute an undeniable challenge for financial markets and for the financial sector right now. A further example could be the huge efforts that European authorities are undertaking in terms of deploying a strategy for Europe with regard to sustainability. The lack of available and reliable data to underpin informed decisions and to measure the assumption of risks may endanger this whole strategy already launched. These are just two quick macroeconomic examples that highlight the complex nature of constructing coherent public programs in the long run. Today is a privileged opportunity for us to gain further insight into the importance of economic policy design from Professor Miguel. So thank you very much again, Ted, for being here. And Gianmarco, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just make a quick introduction. So Ted, as you said, is the Oxford Professor of Environmental and Resource Economics at Berkeley. He's made significant contributions in several areas of economic development, mainly focusing on Africa. He's written seminal papers in studying, for example, the causes and consequences of civil conflict, studying the interactions between health, education, environment, and productivity for the poor, the impacts of ethnic divisions on public good provisions and collective action. The body of work, of Ted's work, has inspired a large stream of academic research in development. And actually, if you look at the references of my own papers and the syllabus of my graduate class in development, you'll see several of his papers, and it will be clear that he's one of my intellectual heroes. But the impact of his work is not only in the ivory tower of academia. His work has had a significant impact in the discussion of development policies around the world. Just to pick a couple of examples, his 2004 Econometrica paper with Michael Kremer on the effects of deworming drugs has sparked a broad discussion that started a large program for free distribution of deworming drugs in East Africa. His work on climate change and its effects on the economic lives of the poor is quite present in the policy discussion that we are currently having on the effects of global warming and so on. Not only that, Ted has written 3 books, one of which, the latest one was released last month, if I'm not mistaken, and builds on his work as a faculty director of the Berkeley Initiative for the Transparency in the Social Sciences, and contributes to the discussion on how to improve the credibility of academic findings in the social sciences. So, yeah, you've come to hear him, not me. So the floor is yours, Ted. Thank you very much for your visit.
Thanks. Thanks so much for the introductions, and it's really great to be here. It's an honor to give this talk and be here with John Monaco, who's a co-author of mine and a friend of mine, and also I hadn't seen Jaume. Let me see, where's Jaume in the audience? I hadn't seen Jaume in a long time since I was an undergrad, and he was my undergrad advisor at MIT, so it's really special to see him again and be part of this community. So thank you again for the invitation. I'm going to discuss research related to work of mine in Kenya. It's work that I've been pursuing for the last about 6 or 7 years, and it's really motivated by an interest, broadly speaking, in issues of energy and environment in low-income countries. I think people are familiar with the fact that most of the growth in energy consumption in the next few decades is going to come from poor countries, and right now, there's tremendously important policy decisions around electrification and energy use that are happening in real time. And this really motivated the project. So the title of the talk is, Does Electrification Help the Poor? It's based on several papers, and I'm not going to kind of go through this, but this is just to give you a sense. Most of the discussion is based on the first paper listed above, which is now forthcoming in the Journal of Political Economy. That's really the base of the talk today. But I'm going to bring in evidence from a couple of other published papers and then a new working paper as well. So if later on in the question and answer there's specifics about particular results or whatnot, I'm happy to get into more, more technical details. I'll give more of an overview of the main approach and findings today. So this is a map that motivated us when we started this project. I think people are familiar with this kind of image. This is the world at night, and you can see where there are lights at night. And of course, where there's light is where people live, but also where there's electricity. So you can see a huge concentration in Europe and California and Japan, etc. Where you see a big missing amount of light is in sub-Saharan Africa. So now there's almost 1 billion people who live in sub-Saharan Africa, but except for Johannesburg, Lagos, Nairobi, a few big cities, on this map from a few years ago, you see darkness. And the reason why is, despite all this population, the majority of population in sub-Saharan Africa lives without electricity. So this is the challenge that we faced. Things are beginning to change. There is rapid expansion in many settings, but there are still about 600 million Africans living without electricity. And because of this, this kind of image and the importance of electricity, presumably for development, foreign aid donors have made electrification in Africa a huge priority. So Power Africa was the name of the signature foreign aid initiative of the Obama administration, with many billions of dollars going into this initiative. So they say 2 out of 3 people in sub-Saharan Africa lack electricity, and they're going to change that. And they put a very big focus in this initiative on funding some of the key backbone infrastructure to bring electricity out to the regions of different countries, as well as on electrification of homes, residential electrification. That was a priority of the project. It wasn't just the US government. DFID, the British aid donors, not to be outdone, launched their Energy Africa, which had a very similar goal. They had a little bit more of an emphasis on solar energy, but again, a big focus on electrification. And the African Development Bank has their own initiative, the New Deal on Energy. And the president of the AFDB, when launching this initiative a couple of years ago, said, without electricity, there's no future, no growth, no progress. This is, he viewed as really maybe the most essential thing he and the bank could do in building up African infrastructure, was investing in electrification. So this is the challenge. This is the policy environment we've been in over the past 5 years ago. Our goal in this study is to provide new evidence on the economics of electrification with a focus on residential electrification, which is one of the big policy priorities of the recent period. And we study this in rural Kenya, in an area where I've been working really since grad school. Kenya is a very interesting case. Kenya is a bit ahead of other African countries in one dimension. They've already established a lot of the large-scale infrastructure to bring electricity to all regions of the country. And in fact, there was a program starting about 11 years ago, 12 years ago, to try to connect all secondary schools, clinics, and markets around the country. So, over 90% of those public institutions are already connected. What that means is, in most of rural Kenya, an electricity connection isn't very far away. It might be less than a kilometer away. So there's a population in Kenya that we and others have started calling not off-grid or on-grid. We call them under-grid. Because basically the grid is there. It's connecting a school near where people live. But at the start of our study 5 years ago, only about 5% of households in rural Kenya had actually been connected. So it's kind of an amazing opportunity to try to understand how connecting these households could affect their lives, when a lot of the big investment has already taken place in the large-scale infrastructure. So that's our goal. We worked on this project closely with the utility company. So we were very lucky, on the one hand, to establish connections with the utility, with the government, and we worked closely with them to carry out some experiments that varied access to the electricity grid. And that's what we're going to study today. So what do we think of when we think of the economics of electricity? Well, if you guys remember Econ 1, the electricity utility network is one of the canonical examples of a natural monopoly. It's a case that once you build out infrastructure, the cost of connecting every additional household would typically fall, because now instead of having to build out all this infrastructure and sending a line all the way out to the house way over there, if its neighbor is already connected, it's pretty cheap to connect that house. So this is a case with very high fixed costs, because you need to design the grid, get the engineers there, get a truck full of materials and workers out to maybe a remote village where transport costs are expensive. But once you've paid that fixed cost, the marginal cost is going to be quite low. And again, the more you do, the cheaper it is. So we've conveyed that here with the kind of typical natural monopoly figure. You can see the falling average cost, the big fixed cost, falling, declining marginal cost. And there's also a downward sloping demand curve. And the social planner here would want to equate marginal cost to demand. So you can see the little blue circle there. That would be the price of a connection that the planner would want to set. Now, whether or not this is a worthwhile public investment is going to depend on the magnitude of that fixed cost versus the consumer surplus that is generated by the connection. So we can see the consumer surplus by the area under the demand curve. At the same time, if we price at marginal cost, there is going to have to be some subsidy coming from the public sector from somewhere that pays for the fixed cost. So actually, the way we've drawn it here, if you look at the area under the demand curve, it's actually going to be larger than the fixed cost conveyed by that dotted rectangle there. So again, this is just the Econ 1 folks are familiar with, and this would be a case where the public subsidy makes sense. I want to talk about two other cases that are also interesting and that may be relevant empirically in our case. So there's the classic case. There could also be a high-cost case. There could be a case where that fixed cost is really high. For some reason, maybe for a very remote village, the cost is so high that now if we look at the area under the demand curve, the consumer surplus, it's smaller than the area of that fixed cost in the rectangular area there. So the high-cost case would be one where, despite the fact that we'd have an intersection there between the demand curve and the marginal cost curve, the social planner would decide, look, this doesn't make sense. It's just too expensive. So this is the second case. There's a third case that maybe we're thinking about, and that's now over on the right. We call it the spillover case. There could be a case where the private demand curve is not the same as the social demand curve, you could call it. And the social demand curve now is in dark colors. Imagine that when I get connected, my neighbors benefit in some way. They can use my electricity. So there's some kind of externality that I'm not taking into account when I decide whether or not to connect. That would be the simplest sort of externality. But there could be other reasons why observed private demand for electricity deviates from what's socially optimal. People may not understand the benefits of electricity. It's new in their area. So they don't demand it much, even though the truth is if they're connected, they would benefit a lot. There could also be credit constraints that would suppress observed private demand, even though there are future benefits. You could even imagine cases where the discount rate that that govern poor households' behavior is different than the social planner's discount rate. So for all those reasons, we might imagine that there's some discrepancy between observed private demand and social demand. Okay, so all of this is Econ 1 material. What's going to be unusual about our setting is I'm going to be able to show you empirical analogs of most of these curves. And we're going to actually say, in the case of rural Kenya, what does this look like? Which of these cases are we in? Classic case, high-cost case, or the case where maybe the spillovers are very large? That was the goal of the study from the start. So what did we do? We set up an experiment in Western Kenya. We worked in 150 communities. This is the vast majority of rural communities in a particular region of Western Kenya. We put a lot of effort into collecting data on households. We did household censuses and geotagged every household in these 150 communities up to a distance of 600 meters from the main electrical transformer. 600 meters is an important distance because Kenya Power will connect any rural consumer who lives within 600 meters of a transformer. Beyond that, there's excess surcharges that can be quite expensive because then they have to run more poles farther and farther away from the transformer. So this was just following Kenya Power policy. Up to 600 meters, there was a standard rate. It was $400 to be connected to the grid in our study period and for something like a decade before our study period. It was a stable policy. So we first censused these households, and this is what it looked like. So we went around, and you can see the 600-meter line, and the T there is the transformer in the middle. And the circles are households. So the green circles are households that are not connected to the grid. The yellow circles at baseline were connected to the grid. And actually, this is fairly typical for a community. There are 85 households in that circle. The average for our sample is 84.7. That's why I'm showing you this. This is like typical density of households. The bigger the circle, the more household members, from 1 to 10. And so you see that variation. And at baseline, only a few of these households are connected. So that's also representative of our data, where between 5 and 6% of the sample at baseline was connected. So this is kind of the status quo ante the project. You can also see on the map here some squares. Those are businesses. Some are electrified, some aren't. You can see some triangles. Those are public structures like clinics and schools. So this is a pretty typical rural Kenyan setting. I want to point out a couple of things. First, one thing that you'll notice is there's no central village. So maybe some of you are familiar with villages in South Asia and India, Bangladesh, where the tradition is to have a central village and then people walk out to their farms. That's not how it works in this part of East Africa. Here, people basically live on their farms and their land is sort of around them. So the median distance between me and the nearest household in our sample is more than 50 meters. It's 53 meters. So I'm mentioning that because in some cases where there's even denser population, if I get a connection, you can steal from my connection. You can basically put a wire in and try to steal it. But here, if you have to go 50, 60, 70 meters away, it's much harder to steal a connection. You almost have to build your own poles to try to steal the connection. And we find almost no cases of power theft among neighbors. So that just isn't an issue for us. So this is the sense. The other thing you can see here is there's sort of a road, going through the area. They put the transformer right on the road. So this is the background. What does our sample look like? Again, a pretty typical Kenyan sample. About 3/4 are mainly farmers, and then some people have wage jobs and self-employment. Very few have attended secondary school of the adults. Now that's changing for young Kenyans, but at this time the respondents, the household heads, very few had gone to secondary school. Average cash earnings are about $200 a year in nominal terms. It's about twice that in PPP. And then, of course, the bulk of income is coming from subsistence agriculture. So per capita income, including subsistence agriculture, is maybe $800 or $900 a year. But cash income is scarce. That's also going to be important when we think about what people can pay for. But what's kind of unusual about this population and interesting that people have noted before in East African cases is there is some interesting technology people have access to. So at baseline, 3/4 owned a cell phone. By the time of our follow-up surveys a few years later, 86% own cell phones. We've been going back to these communities, and now 90% own cell phones. So that's one thing that's an interesting point to keep in mind. There's even a rise in smartphones just in the last few years. So a year and a half ago, an cheap Android smartphone in Kenya was $100. Now it's $60. National penetration now is over 30%. And even in rural areas, people are getting smartphones. So just to give you a bit of a sense of, this is a dynamic setting, and there is technology adoption in some dimensions. And one of the things we'll find out later when people get connections that they want to do with their connection is charge their cell phone. That's going to be one of the main uses of power. like all the rest of us, right? Okay, so what did we do? We collected data at baseline. We did this household survey, as I mentioned. We took a random sample of households, a representative sample. So we get about 15 per community. We have 2,000 something households, and we administered a very detailed survey on energy consumption, economic activities, health, education, a whole range of outcomes. A small number of households, as I mentioned, were already connected at baseline, about 5%. We also surveyed them. So we have a good sense of what they were doing. And they do look quite different, I will say, from the rest of the sample. That 5% that are already connected are way richer, more educated than the rest of the population. When we talk about subsidizing power, though, we're only going to subsidize it for that other 95% who don't have a connection yet. Then we carried out an experiment. We randomized half of the 150 communities, so 75, into 3 different treatment groups with different subsidy levels. And again, we were lucky to collaborate with Kenya Power on this activity. It took several years of discussions and meetings, but they went along with it as long as we would raise the money for the subsidies, which we managed to do by a miracle. So this is what the experiment looked like. There's a high subsidy group of 25 communities, and people in those communities were offered a connection for free. Basically, the NGO we worked with went to those communities and said, you're going to get a free connection. We'll help you with all the paperwork. We're going to help take care of all the wiring within the house. This was a very good deal for that group. There was a second group that had a 60% subsidy. They only had to pay about $170. That's much cheaper than the $400, the standard amount. There was a low subsidy group with a 30% subsidy, and then we have the control group that pays the $400, which is just status quo. We collected data for them, but we didn't do anything else. Okay, so this is the variation we're going to exploit. Now, I think people already can guess how we're going to use this data for the first step of the analysis. We're going to be able to get a demand curve for an electricity connection, clearly. There's going to be random variation in price, and we're going to see take-up. But the other thing we're able to do, which is more unusual methodologically, is because different numbers of households take up at different prices, we're going to get experimental variation in the size of the local project that was actually constructed. Because Kenya Power shared all their cost data with us, we're able to trace out the economies of scale with exogenous variation in project size. So that was an unusual aspect of the design. So from the same design, we're able to estimate the demand curve and the cost curves that I showed you before. So I'll put those up in a little bit. But that's one of the methodological innovations of this design. Okay, so this is the design that I mentioned. And as I just alluded to, we're going to ask this first question. What is the demand for a grid connection? When you offer this to households, how many of them want it? Is this something that they want? We certainly had anecdotal evidence people wanted a connection, but how does it look like when they have to pay? And I should say that when we made these subsidized offers to households, they were given 2 full months to raise the money for the offer. So we didn't just show up that day and say, do you have $170? We said, you have 8 weeks to find that money. We wanted to give them enough time to figure out if it was sort of reasonable time frame. So what do we find? This is the experimental data. I want you to just focus for now on the dark line, and then I'll tell you about the other 2 plots. The dark, thick line is the experimental demand curve. There's a few things here that are not so surprising and some a little more surprising. The first one is when the price is 0, almost everybody takes up. So it isn't like some people don't like power. 98% of households, when it's free, say, give me that connection. There were actually a few people that refused the connection. Several of them anecdotally. There were a few old widows living in homes who said, look, I'm not going to use the connection. Don't give me the connection. Give it to somebody else. And we said, but you're in the treatment group, you know? So it was a little bit weird. So they didn't get connections. So that was like a weird part of the experimental design, unfortunately. But you can see basically everybody wants the connection. The other thing that's not so surprising is when the price is the full market price, over the course of the next year and a half, only 1% of households, between 1 and 2%, got connected. Now that's not so surprising. Remember, this transformer had already been in place for several years, and only 5% of households had chosen to get connected on their own. So yeah, it was like 1 or 2% a year are going to get connected over time. So that was the, I'll take questions at the end maybe. So that's the next finding. In between, we have these intermediate subsidy levels, and We have take-up at the low subsidy here. That's very low, actually. And then even here at the 60% subsidy, take-up's about 23%. So, you might ask yourself, well, is that high? Is that low? Is that what you thought it would be or not? Well, we actually have data on what we thought it would be. We wrote a pre-analysis plan. And in the pre-analysis plan, not only did we say we would show this figure, we had a fixed budget. I mentioned to you guys we had to raise money for these subsidies. We had a fixed budget, so we had to guess what take-up would be at all these levels. And if take-up was higher than we thought, I was going to have to take a second mortgage on my house. So we were very serious. We had many debates with the field team ourselves. What is this demand curve going to look like? And what you can see is here, the pre-analysis plan demand curve. This is what we thought the demand curve would look like. So we agreed, look, when it's free, everybody will take it. When it's not, no one will take it up. We guessed that. In between, say at this intermediate level, we thought take-up would be almost twice as high. So this is lower demand than we expected. Now, after we had run the experiment, we found out about a Kenyan government report that had been written in 2015, after we had distributed the subsidies. The government at that time, not known to us or the public, was starting to plan for a big rural electrification project, which they rolled out a couple years later. This is their internal planning report, which somehow got shared with us. This was their guess as to what the demand curve would look like. So actually, their guess as to the demand curve was pretty close to our guess, and it was much higher than observed demand. So I think we can say with confidence, demand was lower than we had expected or that policymakers had expected here. It's relatively low demand. Okay, so demand was lower than we thought. The second thing that we can do, as I mentioned, is we can ask, are there economies of scale? And I already told you how we're going to do that. We're going to have different sized projects, because when it was free, we have almost everybody in the sample getting connected. When it's not free, very few people or intermediate numbers are getting connected. So what does this whole process look like of connections? Once the subsidies came in and people paid, the engineers at Kenya Power had to draw up a design plan. They went out to these communities and they had to sketch out from the central transformer how many poles, either these circles are pole by pole, are they going to do to reach that household? How many lines are they going to put in? This is the road, and actually this is the community I showed you on the map before, just to give you a sense. So in this community, a fair number of households we're going to get connected. So this was the first bit of work that they had to do. Then they had to go in, send teams, dig the poles, put in the wiring. This takes a truck going out to the community. They dig the poles, and even quite poor households that don't have iron roofs and have mud walls are sometimes getting connected here, because that's about a third of households in this part of rural Kenya have these sort of more informal structures. So this is the reality. This kid is pretty interested in what's going on, hoping this guy isn't going to fall. But these guys are professionals, and it usually works out fine. After they built out the pole infrastructure, there was wiring that was needed. In our treatment group, we contracted with an engineering firm in Nairobi to build this. It's called a ready board. Wiring inside a home, especially a home that's an informal mud structure, is complicated. So we provided a ready-made solution that can just be attached to the wall, that has space for a light, 2 plugs, and a fuse. So this is the basics that someone would need to get some of the benefits of electricity. So this would get installed, as you can see, even on a more informal structure. And then the Kenya Power technician would install the meter. Now, the way the metering works is prepaid metering. So if you're familiar with how cell phones work in many countries, where you have to basically prepay from a scratch card or prepay with a code, that's how electricity works now in Kenya. You can't overspend. You can't overspend each month because you only have 300 shillings worth of money that you've put on your meter. So people here, he's showing her, here's the card. He's entering in the code for her and giving her her kind of basic supply of electricity. So you can see there's several steps to this process, and I'll talk about it more a little later about what delays were faced at some points. But this is the basics of the process. This is the figure where we're able to trace out the cost curves. And I want you to focus on the dark one here. We have different functional forms, but the kind of best functional form is this dark one here. This is community coverage. So just like the axes I showed you before, this is the average cost per connection. If there's only 1 or 2 connections, the cost can be thousands of dollars, because you have to get these engineers to draw the plans. You've got to get a truck with materials just for that one household. But every additional household you connect, the cost falls, 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 and then it continues falling, so that when you get to 100% coverage, our best estimate is the average cost will be between $700 and $800 per connection. Okay, so again, this is based on the experimental variation, and with pretty mild functional form assumptions, we get the average cost kind of directly, and with some mild assumptions, we can back out the marginal cost. We basically just allow for a fixed cost and then a potentially declining marginal cost. So we can get the kind of curves that I showed you before. So this was the kind of main result of the data collection, and here we find very strong evidence of economies of scale, just as you'd expect. So this was sort of documenting what we understood, but doing it with a lot of data in this way. So now we reach the third and maybe most interesting or important part of the study, which is, okay, what are the welfare implications of this? We're talking about how electricity will be transformative. What does it do? What does this all mean if we put the data together? And here the results are a little different than we expected. And because of the results on this figure, we did several additional analyses that I'm going to tell you. So this is the figures I just showed you. I showed you the demand curve, and now I've put the average cost curve on the same axis with the backed out marginal cost curve. Now remember, I was telling you, even when it was $100-something, most people didn't pay. They basically only took it up when it was free or very cheap. And I also just told you the average cost was $700 to $800. So if you put those things together, you're already getting a sense that demand is way lower than cost here. So our best guess is that the demand curve everywhere lies below the marginal cost curve. So this is like our high cost case from above. This surprised us. People want power. We were reading the policy statements, but people aren't connecting to the grid. So when you kind of put this together and try to add up consumer surplus and compare it to total cost, like the figure before, the total cost is something like 4 times the consumer surplus. Very surprising for us. Very surprising result. But this isn't the end of the story. We wanted to go deeper into this, and we do it in several ways. 3 ways in particular. The first thing is we thought, well, maybe demand is low because people don't understand the benefits. But once they get power, they're going to realize the benefits of power. They're going to go in and use it and benefit in all kinds of ways. So we did a follow-up survey. We actually did 2 surveys, one a year and a half later, one closer to 3 years later, to see what happened to the treatment households and control households. And again, most of the households that were connected were in this free treatment group where everybody got connected, and then we have a control group where no one got connected. So we have like a very nice comparison there. And then we have the intermediate groups as well. So what happens to households when they get connected up to almost 3 years later? Do they benefit in ways maybe they didn't anticipate? Maybe that's why they didn't demand it. So that's going to be our first explanation, but I'll tell you 2 others in a second. So we did a very detailed survey. We tracked 90-something% of respondents. We surveyed them in a very wide range of areas: energy consumption, time use, productivity measures like wages, profits, asset accumulation. We took reported health. I'll mention we also collected data on education. I'll say more about that. We also thought maybe when you get electricity, you get a radio and a TV and you have very different political knowledge and political attitudes. So we had a whole series of questions on political and social attitudes. We even tested them on Kenyan politics, how many ministers they could name. Did they know that the president of the US' name was Obama? Most people knew that. He was from like 20 kilometers away from our study area, his father. So people knew that. Community outcomes and security. Again, maybe with lighting, there's greater safety. So we had a whole series of questions on crime victimization. This was a very long survey, but we wanted to capture how life was changing with electricity. In particular, we were so interested in one particular angle. We said, well, we know with light, if you just have a light bulb at home, kids could maybe study more. We were very focused on that. We said that could be something that really yields long-run benefits. So we raised additional funding to administer tests to thousands of kids, adolescents in this area, to see if the kids who got electricity are doing better on tests. Are they learning more? That just seemed so important to us. So this is just an example of one case where we pulled kids on a Saturday to take this test. We also administered a survey to them about their study habits, their aspirations, thinking, now that they have electricity, maybe they aspire to go to college, which they hadn't done before. Okay, so what do we find? We find some unexpected things. One thing that was not surprising is we do find that electricity consumption does go up immediately, but basically nothing else that we measure in terms of economic dimensions or these other social dimensions changes. Income doesn't go up, hours worked doesn't go up, asset ownership doesn't go up, self-employed business formation doesn't go up. So we measure this for thousands of households, and taken together, when we combine them in an index, we have these pretty precise zero estimates. We don't see any effect on economic outcomes. This was surprising. Of course, given the demand results, maybe not so surprising, right? People already kind of, by revealed preference, weren't willing to put $100 or $200 into getting an electricity connection, and they're not benefiting that much in terms of income. So on some level, these are consistent, even if surprising for us. The non-economic outcomes were also rather disappointing. We don't see effects on political knowledge, health, security, and even the child test scores were just a 0. And this one was one that was particularly disappointing for all of us as educators, as scholars. You know, we thought maybe this would have a benefit. We had run these surveys among kids, and we were trying to figure out what happened. So we asked them, like, when did they study? What time of the day did they study? We had these time use surveys. And it turns out that kids in the treatment group were studying more in the evening, after dark, 15 or 20 minutes more. But then they were studying 15 minutes less in the afternoon. So they were playing more, they were with their friends more, and they waited till later to study because now they had light, so they could study later at home. So they're just like kids everywhere, basically. So we don't see that there. There's one exception, and I think this is an important one, and I think it causes us not to want to overinterpret our results. The one significant result out of all our main outcomes was when we asked people if they were happier in the treatment group, they were significantly happier. And that's kind of a moderate magnitude, maybe 0.2 of a standard deviation unit. They were more likely to say, yeah, I'm very happy. Now, we can't sort of detect the improvements in our measures, but there's a couple of explanations for this. One is maybe we're missing some dimension that's really important. We try to measure everything, but maybe there's some way this is benefiting their lives that we can't measure. So I think, you know, research always calls for humility, and maybe we didn't get it. You know, we didn't capture something important. The other one is maybe a little less favorable, which is traditionally having an electricity connection was associated with high social status. Only the rich people had connections, and they only started getting them the previous few years. So when you get a connection, you feel good about it because this is something kind of elite. So that would be another interpretation. We can't really distinguish between those, but that is one gain that we do see. Okay. Let me just say one more point here. We looked at this in two other ways, and let me briefly mention them, and then I'll go to some further findings. Two other things we were concerned about, other than measuring direct impacts, were the following. One was credit constraints. Maybe if only people's credit constraints were eased, they would be able to purchase more electricity. Now, of course, for the group in the free treatment, the full subsidy, credit constraints don't matter. We gave them the connection. So then it's just a question of what they do with it. So that was our way of dealing with that. But we did ask a bunch of questions in the survey, very detailed questions saying, look, for certain credit offers, would you actually get a connection? To see what demand for an offer would be if it were provided with credit. And we do get a lot more demand, sort of stated demand, hypothetically if people got credit. Now, we didn't have the money to offer credit, so that's just hypothetical. But when we try to back out what the implied valuation of a connection would be, because we offered different credit terms, so we can kind of trace out the equivalent of a demand curve when there is credit, it's still far below our cost curve. So even in a probably best case scenario, hypothetical stated demand with credit, where people may exaggerate their demand, like, would you take it up if I gave you this hypothetical credit? It still looks like demand is less than cost. So that was another one to keep in mind. Okay, so what do we make about all this? Why didn't electrification have much impact? Our sort of leading explanation of this at this point is, or a question you could ask is, were these households just too poor to do anything with electricity when they got it? And there's some evidence for this. When households get connected in the treatment group, they consume minuscule amounts of power. They're consuming like a few kilowatt hours per month. And if you back out what that's equivalent to, the amount of power the typical household consumes is equivalent to having one light bulb and charging your cell phone. That's basically the amount of power that people are using. So it's very small. We also very carefully tracked which appliances they had bought. And there is a slight increase in appliances they own, like buying a radio or buying a television. But the difference between the treatment and control group goes from 1.8 appliances to 2 appliances. So there's just this tiny increase in appliances. And when we asked people why they didn't buy more, they said cost. So giving a connection wasn't enough. There are complementary investments households need to make to use power. This is a way in which electricity as a utility is very different than water. With water, when I have it, I can drink it. Like I can turn the tap and use it right away. With electricity, I have to plug something into it. So giving me a free connection and no appliances, nothing really happens in this population, this poor rural Kenyan population. So the other point I wanted to mention, back in the kind of simple figures and the theoretical framework, I said, well, maybe there are spillovers. We did try to measure spillovers. We sampled a random subset of households in the treatment villages who had not been offered the subsidy to see if they gain in any way. Of course, there's like 0 effects on everything for this group because there wasn't even any effect on those who got the power. So there was no spillover. So in terms of that social demand curve maybe shifting way out because of spillovers, we see no evidence for that. Okay, so that's just to close the loop on that first set of cases. Okay, so what are the welfare implications? It looks like costs are far higher than consumer surplus, and we really don't have any evidence of gains here. Now, looking at this, taking this together, you may say, well, this is depressing, and this is a null result, and what are we to make of it? I do want to make one statement. I know there's some students in the room, so it's kind of directed, I think, partially to them. A null result, a 0 result, may feel very demoralizing or disappointing or a failure, and I think sometimes in our field we're sort of taught that, oh, this is it's a failure. But this is a very important result. It's very important as researchers to publish null results. There's literally billions of dollars going into doing exactly this right now all over sub-Saharan Africa. And when we've shared this data at the World Bank with the Kenyan government, with USAID, it raises their interest for sure. If there's anything that data like this can do to help people formulate policy that's more evidence-based or to rethink policy, that would be valuable. So I would just say that even though null results can feel disappointing, we should be just as enthusiastic about them as researchers as something with a lot of stars. So that's my ideological statement as a researcher for you guys. So this gets us towards the end, and I'll just wrap up with a couple more slides. How much should these results really guide policy? And again, here I want to call for maybe a little bit of humility, because the Kenyan case may differ than other cases. One thing in particular that I've talked about is these very high costs of connection in Kenya. Are the costs too high on some level? Well, they may be too high. We did an exercise to try to figure out how inflated costs were in the Kenyan program due to corruption. So corruption is a pervasive issue in Kenya. It's a pervasive issue in many societies. What we did is we went back to those plans, those designs I showed you, which show where every single pole is supposed to be in the design. And those are done following engineering standards. If poles are too far apart, it puts a lot of pressure on the poles. They could fall. And it also means the lines will sag. And that's very dangerous. People can come into contact with the lines. So you need the wires to be a certain height. You need the poles to be a certain distance. When we go back, we actually sent our field team to all the communities in the sample, and they counted poles, and we compare them to the plans. Something like 20 to 25% of poles disappear. Poles are missing. Other supplies are missing. And we know anecdotally, because our field team was watching this happen at some times, that the contractors who were hired, the subcontractors hired by Kenya Power to build out these grids, would get supplies from the Kenya Power warehouses, sometimes drive a kilometer down the road, and then sell supplies. So it was systematic leakage of supplies. This could raise costs, for sure. We did another exercise with Google Maps where we traced out the distance they were supposed to drive from the warehouse to the site, and we compared it to the mileage that was billed, and the miles billed are something like 32% higher than Google Maps. So on a number of different dimensions, there's overbilling. Now that 20-30% overbilling isn't going to change the basic picture for us. It's like 4 times higher, the costs, but it's part of the story. Maybe in a place with better monitoring of the contractors, you wouldn't get such a big gap. So that's one way that external validity is important to think about. The second one, could poor service quality be a problem? Once we went through this process, we collected the subsidies and we tried to get people connected, we gave the money to Kenya Power, On average, it took more than 6 months to get connected. That was the time frame. That is extremely long. People got very frustrated. And you could imagine that would suppress demand, obviously. It took a very long time. The reason why is traditionally to get a connection, Kenya Power employees expect to get paid a bribe. Now, because we were handling the money for the people getting subsidies and we didn't pay bribes, that almost certainly extended out the time frame of connections. But again, if you don't want to pay a bribe, it could take a very long time. The sort of conventional wisdom in Kenya is it could take 100 days even if you pay a bribe. So maybe we slowed them down a little bit more, but it was still going to take a long time. And even when they get connected, the work isn't always the best. So this is a real household that we were alerted to. The connection was supposed to go into the ready board. That's a live wire that was just left by Kenya Power. That's the exception. Usually the wires are connected. But there were enough of these cases where you really could wonder if service quality is a big part of the problem here. Okay, and then finally I talked about credit constraints. I'll skip over that, but in terms of service quality more broadly, grid reliability is low in Kenya. 19% of our sites had blackouts during our study period. The median length of a blackout was 4 months. So we called the California utility to get the contrast. In the course of a year, 0.2 of 1% of transformers go out in California, and it takes 4 to 5 hours to fix them. Here it was 19%, and it took 4 months on average. So again, why are you going to pay for something when reliability is so low? So again, maybe if service quality were better, maybe if you got it faster, maybe if there weren't so much leakage, you'd have more demand and cheaper supply. So again, we don't want to overstate our results, but this is Kenya today, and this is many parts of Africa today. So, we're saying something that's relevant to the world, but with institutional improvements, maybe things wouldn't be so bad. So let me just conclude and maybe take some questions with this question. Should rural home electrification be a policy priority? Subject to my caveat that we don't want to, overstate things. Is it likely to reduce poverty? I would say maybe not. Our data is certainly not consistent with this being a great anti-poverty program. I think I can say that, without overstating it. There's our evidence from Kenya. There's a new paper from India by Fiona Berlig and Louis Prionis. Fiona's at UChicago, Louis is at University of Maryland, that uses a large-scale program in India, a regression discontinuity design that also tried to connect rural households, that also measures similar outcomes, that also find zero effect. So now we have 2 large-scale studies showing similar findings. I think we were most disappointed by the lack of the child learning results, at least for me. I thought that would be something that's promising. What are some directions for future research? We're still interested in this possibility that maybe benefits will eventually emerge. So we're going back out into the field soon to do the 5-year follow-up. Very few of folks in the control communities have been connected, maybe only about 10% over the last few years. So we still have a control group. And we're going to see if maybe eventually they buy appliances. Eventually kids learn more. We're still hopeful. So that's what we're going to do. I think there's a lot of questions about whether maybe subsidizing appliances would make a difference. Maybe if you give someone a connection and you actually give them the appliance, then you'd see the benefits. And then finally, it seems so obvious, but the broader political economy context, the institutional context, can't be separated from our results. And the issues of poor service quality, delays, leakage are probably central to our disappointing findings. So that's another area, I think, for interesting research. Okay, let me leave it at that. I had a question too that I didn't take, so hopefully you can ask too.
So yeah, very interesting. I just have a question regarding the structure of the village and whether you can estimate how that affects take-up, whether you thought about that, or whether that affects external validity, no? Maybe some areas have everybody's living together, as you said in the beginning, and that would bring costs down. Maybe you can say something about that.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think this kind of village structure, which is typical in East Africa, of homes being spread out, will almost certainly raise average costs relative to a situation where homes are even closer. So I think costs would fall. We do have variation in population density. So I showed you a typical community with 80-something households, but we also have communities with 30 households and communities with 180 households. And we looked for kind of a cost gradient, and it's there, but it's not very strong. So you might even need even higher density to see big cost savings. So that's something that we explored. but it didn't yield very definitive results.
Thanks for the talk. So my question is maybe related to your other research that you also presented yesterday, just trying to put two things together. So yesterday you told us that if you just throw money at poor people, then, you know, they're happier, they consume more, and then, you know, there's also positive spillovers in the local economy. Today you're telling us that these infrastructure investments don't seem to make people happy. So, of course, one issue could be is that, you know, we know that cash versus in-kind transfers, so people know what, you know, how to spend their money to. But the other thing is perhaps the time frame also matters, right? So yesterday you told us, oh, you give people money, they're you know, they're consuming it, and you know, businesses are getting this money. So in the short term, but maybe this is gonna go away quickly. Versus today, you're telling us nothing seems to happen in 3 years. Is it going to happen maybe later? So it's just in terms of trying to think about what the government should be spending money on. What do you think is more important, like the time frame or the cash versus in kind?
Yeah, it's a great question, and part of the reason we're doing the follow-up here is because we want a better answer to that question. This investment could take a while. It may take time for households to save up for appliances, so maybe we do see a 5-year result or longer-term results. We don't want to rule that out. It's certainly the case with the cash program yesterday. It's like people spend it right away. You see the effect in the local economy right away, but maybe 5 years later, it's done.
Because they didn't invest or anything.
Yeah, they didn't invest very much. That was one of the findings from yesterday. So, you know, both of these projects started at the same time in basically neighboring counties, and there was even a little bit of overlap in terms of the areas, and we're doing the 5-year follow-ups for both right now. So we kind of designed them a little bit to do that. And the other thing I'll say is the value of a connection was like a bit more than $1,000 here, $1,200. The cash transfer was $1,000. So basically we have like polar opposite investments in basically the same area. One is just pure cash. The other one is like the canonical infrastructure investment. And we're going to be able to see, you know, in the short run, clearly cash was better. Maybe not in the long run. I'll say one more thing, which was interesting. In the cash study, I didn't mention it yesterday, people got $1,000. They could have used that to buy an electricity connection. So we kind of ease the credit constraint for them and the appliance constraint, okay? And you might say, revealed preference, what did they do? We found that in the treatment group of our cash group that I discussed in seminar yesterday, 1% of them got electrified. So they had the money for the connection, the appliances, everything they could have wanted, they didn't do it. And I think that's like another piece of revealed preference evidence that electricity wasn't something that they saw as transformative. So I do hope that maybe at some point when we have both of these follow-ups, we could write a comparison piece. We're thinking along the lines of what you're saying of, you know, how do these compare? But we're not there yet.
Mine is a very basic question. How do people charge their cell phones if they don't have energy?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We asked about this at baseline, and something, I think it was like 40% of people went to shops. So if you go to a market or you go to a shop, people, shop owners would sell, you know, for a few shillings you could charge your phone. And that's sort of a well-established, you know, way to make a few shillings here and there. And other people would charge it at friends' houses. And then other people would charge it at public facilities. And it's an interesting thing that when we will sometimes interview candidates for field officer positions, and these are like our enumerators, and they don't have electricity at home, it's just completely normal. They'll come to the interview and go, okay, where's the outlet? And charge phones. And they could have, sometimes people have 2 phones. And so it's sort of like if you're in a place with power, it's just normal that you would take advantage of that moment to charge your phone. So people are very savvy about that, but they go to friends, they go to shops.
I have 2 comments. One is, if you offer together access to clean water and electricity, probably the results will be very different. And at the same time, you know that you can offer water without electrification. Mm-hmm. So, at least in Brazil, we found a very different result when you offer together water and electricity than only electricity. Because if you want to bring clean water, you need electricity at home. This is one. And the other is that usually the impact of electricity are long run, as you are preparing to work. Because if you think in the history, the electricity was invented in the 19th century. and the impact was on the middle of the 20.
Yeah.
So I think that
Yeah.
it's not so easy, the impact. I fully agree on the short-term impact, but in the long term.
Yeah, we're very sympathetic to that point. I think it's a very good point. And even historical cases, we've done some work on historical cases. If you look at the rural US in the 1930s, during the Depression, there was a huge effort by the federal government to electrify rural areas. And in the first few years, they didn't find much impact until they subsidized appliances, actually. So, and of course, you know, the rural US was relatively poor almost 100 years ago. So I think Kenya's even poorer than that, and they're just at a stage where they would need appliance subsidies, other assistance to get to the point where electricity will have benefits. And so I'm very sympathetic that maybe these investments in 15 or 20 years could be great, but there's such pressing needs now in the next 5 or 10 years that it's a little hard to justify these investments when there's undernutrition, people don't have water, et cetera. You couldn't pump it, you're saying, without local electricity. Yeah. I guess to have the infrastructure to work. Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how people pay for electricity. So is it very simple to buy the card that where you type in the code, or can people pay with their phones? Or,
Yeah.
and because that could lead to, if people are uncomfortable kind of using that technology, that could suppress demand.
Yeah, it's a great question. The thing that Kenya Power did well in this whole process is they really designed the cards to be very similar to cell phone cards, which everybody's familiar with. And those meters are wireless, so you don't even need to have a smartphone. When you enter the code into the meter, it communicates with the grid or with the cell phone network to recharge. So I think that was good. In the first year and a half of our project, there were several confusing things about the meter, which was, in particular, there was a fixed charge per month, which people weren't familiar with. So if you didn't use power for a few months, you said, oh, I'm not going to charge, I'll save money. When you tried to then put money on the meter, they said, oh, you owe us 50 shillings a month for the last 3 months. So then you had to pay extra to restart it. They've abandoned that now. But they kind of had a model that was better suited for wealthier urban consumers. From 50 shillings was nothing. But for these poor rural farmers, a few dollars is like a lot of money. So they've abandoned that. But that could be part of the story why even consumption was so low these first few years is people couldn't even pay those fixed charges per month. But again, it gets back to the poverty story.
And maybe a quick
please,
follow-up.
yeah.
So how expensive was it actually, the electricity?
In terms of like per kilowatt hour, I think it's something like the average cost over a year is like 12 cents per kilowatt hour, which is like a pretty normal level. Kenya Power also does this very, very well. They do marginal cost pricing, and it's very well regulated actually. And so the price does fluctuate in the year because in certain parts of the year, Kenya gets some hydropower from Uganda, and then prices fall. And other times they need to use sort of more traditional generation, and then the prices are a bit higher. But prices are pretty typical for the region and priced close to marginal cost. So it wasn't like the per unit charge was very high. It was kind of standard.
I was wondering if you have any thoughts about the alternative program of providing a generator like solar or wind compared to the idea of getting hooked to the grid.
Yeah, one of the papers I put up early on, we had some discussion of this because solar is also a policy option in the East African case. There's several private companies that are trying to roll out home solar, and they have a kind of better business model in the sense that they basically give you the panels on credit and then you pay back over time. So it's a little bit of a smarter business model in a place with credit constraints. The commercially available systems in Kenya right now are not very good. They have very low wattage amounts. So you can't use a lot of appliances with the widely available solar systems. Now that may change in the future, but they've done their market research and decided most people want a light bulb and their cell phone, basically. So they're very light systems. And in our treatment areas at baseline, I think 6% of the sample had some kind of solar of some size. Most of them just removed the solar when they got the grid. And anecdotally, we heard these stories of, okay, now I have real power. Because with solar, the prevailing solar systems, you can't even use it for a TV. It was too low wattage. So there would have to be changes in sort of the solar systems that are affordable to make them compete with the grid at this point in Kenya.
Yeah, I wonder whether you're looking at the kind of low marginal benefit cases here, so electrifying these rural private homes. So if you think about electrifying a school or a hospital, the marginal benefit should be higher. I mean, the cost may be high as well. So I don't know if there's any evidence on that, maybe from the previous program.
That's a great question, and I should have put that caveat up front because it's very important. We're discussing residential, and that's where a lot of policy interest has been, but we're not talking about industrial electrification or commercial or public services. As I mentioned, in the Kenyan case, they connected schools and hospitals, and maybe that has a big return. We're not evaluating that. And I think it's almost certainly the case that connecting industrial sites and allowing commercial enterprises to have electricity could have a much higher return than poor rural households. So we don't want this to be taken as sort of being anti-electrification overall, but it's more shifting the debate in the direction of maybe commercial. This summer, we were meeting with some high-level folks at Kenya Power. They know about our results, and they've actually slowed down their, and I'm not saying it's because of our study, maybe we contributed in some small way. They've slowed down their rural electrification activities, and they're trying to look to electrify income-generating activities, enterprises. So even they are kind of feeling like they want to shift in that direction. And that's probably a wise move to promote growth.
Hi. So I was wondering if there was communication between the different villages that had different treatments, and if this could be a reason for the lower demand curve after the experiment than the one you expected, because of, I don't know, well, why should I pay if the other one is getting free? So.
Yeah, we were concerned about that, and in the sort of discussion of the program, we certainly informed all the villages this was a one-time subsidy for these 2 months. Different villages will get different subsidies. We tried to be very clear about it so that people wouldn't think there was some secret or maybe next month they'll get the subsidy. So we tried to be very clear about it, and we haven't gone back with any further subsidy. In the villages that didn't get the full subsidy or in the control villages, we asked people also, why did you not connect? And we were interested if they were saying, well, I'm waiting for a better subsidy. No one said that. Almost everybody said cost. And I think it was 90% of the sample. So our feeling is that we are getting something of a reasonable demand curve. And we hope that the kind of transparency with which we explain the project contributed to that. But we were concerned about that, for sure.
So I was wondering what the labor looks like in a rural village, because if electricity is some kind of investment people are thinking about, and there's no return on investment in any kind of lifetime earnings, then obviously it would be too much of a cost for me too, especially if I'm poor.
Yeah. So this notion of sort of how people could think of making investments and it could affect economic outcomes, we were very interested in that. We measured it. We thought there might be like one kind of obvious use of electricity. Well, there's two. They're both related to water. One would be some irrigation activity. So it could be used to move water from one place to the other. The other could be for pumping, sort of well water. And we basically saw almost none of that. So that would have been a potentially high return activity given that almost everybody is a farmer. But there wasn't this kind of agricultural sector focused use of electrification. And again, I think the reason is pumps are quite expensive. So even if you have electricity, if it's another $120 to get a high quality pump, these households couldn't afford that. So I think for a range of both consumer goods and then potentially productive investments, households couldn't afford them.
So do you think the fact that the survey has been done in Kenya, that is on the equator, that would affect the survey, maybe doing it in South Africa or in a place where during winter there is less light, the utility of 1 more hour of light during winter would be much greater than in Kenya because they have about 12 hours of light, so that's quite enough.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Again, like you said, people's days are really structured around natural light. They wake up early and then they kind of go to bed early on average, and they have 12 hours of light a day. I'm not sure if it would differ in other places. It's a really interesting suggestion. Yeah, there could be different results in other settings.
Okay, so now we can go. Well, thank you very much for the fascinating talk.